On a crisp Monday morning, 14-year-old Michael Jackson stepped into Springfield Middle School for his first day. The school, with its long, white walls and large windows that let in the soft morning light, seemed different from his old school. His fingers nervously tapped against his textbook, a new one, with the fresh smell of paper and ink. Everything about this place felt unfamiliar. Yet he was determined to make it work. He reached up and adjusted his hair, styled with care by his mother that morning. His hair, textured and curly, was something Michael had taken pride in. "You're looking sharp, Michael," his mother had said, giving him a smile that made him feel ready for anything. But that confidence he felt at home wasn't so easy to maintain here. The first few hours at the school were filled with awkward moments, the unfamiliar faces, the rows of students who already seemed to know each other, the chatter filling the halls. This was Michael's first day in this new school. The hallways were wider than he was used to, and the lockers were painted a shade of blue he had never seen before. The smell of fresh paint, mixed with the lemon-scented cleaner, made him feel like everything was new, but it was all so different. Michael sat down at his desk in room 203. He had prepared for this day by wearing his cleanest uniform, a blue blazer, a crisp white shirt, and black shoes polished to perfection. Everything felt like it was in order, except for the fact that he wasn't sure how things would turn out. Would he fit in? Would his classmates like him? And most importantly, would his teachers see him for who he really was? As students filtered into the classroom, Michael could hear the conversations that filled the room. Some kids had already formed their groups, discussing vacations, video games, and what classes they were most excited about. Michael pulled out his notebook and started doodling, trying to blend into the background. He had always been the quiet type, focused on schoolwork, always listening, observing. It wasn't until Mrs. Hall walked into the room that Michael felt a shift in the air. She was the teacher, tall, with short dark hair, a no-nonsense attitude, and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She started with the roll call, her voice authoritative but calm as she read off the list of names. When she reached his name, there was a moment of hesitation, just a brief second, but Michael noticed. He tried to ignore the way her gaze lingered on him, as though she was sizing him up. He had learned to notice these things, even if it was just in passing. "Michael Jackson," Mrs. Hall said, her voice cold. There was no warmth, no welcoming smile, just the curt mention of his name as she continued. It was hard to ignore the faint discomfort she seemed to exude whenever she looked his way, but he remained calm, keeping his head down and trying not to make a fuss. Michael had always been taught to focus on his work, to push through any challenges that came his way. He didn't want to make waves, especially not on his first day. He had big plans for his future, and this was just one more step toward achieving those dreams. He spent the rest of the morning doing his best to blend in, listening carefully to the lesson and raising his hand when he knew the answers. But the first cracks began to show when Mrs. Hall handed back their morning assignments. Michael had worked diligently on his summer break essay detailing a trip to a museum. A summer he had spent learning about science and history, things he loved. When he got his paper back, the grade wasn't what he expected. Mrs. Hall had marked it with a B at, a far cry from the A's he had been used to receiving. His stomach sank as he glanced around. It wasn't just him. Other kids who had written essays of similar length received higher grades. Some had even gotten A+. Confused, Michael glanced at his friend David, who was sitting next to him. David had written about his summer vacation playing soccer, a much less academic topic, but he had received an A. "Hey, Michael, your essay was way better than mine," David whispered, his voice full of concern. Michael just nodded, trying not to let his disappointment show. He didn't want to make a scene. He simply tucked the paper into his folder and tried to focus on the lesson again. But something felt off. It wasn't just the grade. It was the way Mrs. Hall had treated him. The day went on, and the subtle differences in treatment grew. Michael was called on twice to answer questions, but when he spoke up, Mrs. Hall would cut him off abruptly. Moving on to another student, he began to notice the pattern more and more. When he raised his hand to sharpen his pencil, he was made to wait until 3 other students had gone before him. Art class didn't feel much better. Mrs. Hall moved through the desks, offering help to every student around him, but bypassing his desk without even a glance. After class, Michael didn't feel like talking. He felt embarrassed, uncomfortable, and confused, but he still hadn't gathered the courage to speak up. Maybe it was just his imagination. Maybe tomorrow would be better. Maybe Mrs. Hall was just having a bad day. But in the back of his mind, he wondered if it was something more. He couldn't help but notice that he was the only one being singled out like this, the only one treated differently by Mrs. Hall. And it didn't make sense. He had always been good at school, always did his best, and had no reason to be treated this way. But for now, all he could do was wait and hope that things would get better. Days passed, and what had started as small, subtle differences in treatment quickly grew into something much more troubling for Michael. He had hoped that it was just a bad start, a fluke that would clear up with time. But as the weeks went by, the tension in room 203 only grew thicker. Michael tried his best to focus on his schoolwork and ignore the nagging feeling that he was being unfairly treated. However, Mrs. Hall's behavior seemed to target him more each day. She was cold, distant, and sometimes outright dismissive, especially compared to the other students in the class. As if on cue, he was often called out during lessons to answer questions, but was never praised for his correct answers. In contrast, other students who answered incorrectly would still be treated with encouragement, their mistakes overlooked in favor of gentle corrections. One morning, during a math session, Mrs. Hall asked Michael to come to the board to solve a problem. His hands were steady as he wrote the equation, solving it correctly, but as he finished, Mrs. Hall merely glanced at the answer and said, "Sit down." She didn't acknowledge the effort or accuracy. Moments later, Licia, a girl with blonde pigtails, who had been struggling with the same problem, raised her hand to answer. She was slow, and when she made two mistakes, Mrs. Hall praised her effort instead of offering the blunt criticism she gave Michael. "Take your time, dear," she said sweetly. "Math can be tricky." The contrast was stark. David, who had been sitting next to Michael, shot him a concerned look, clearly uncomfortable with what he had just witnessed. "That wasn't fair," David whispered during lunch, pushing his apple around his tray. "She's not supposed to treat students like that, right?" Michael simply shrugged, trying to play it cool, but the pit in his stomach grew larger. Something wasn't right, and deep down, he knew it. The feeling of being treated differently, based on his race, had settled heavily in his chest, but he didn't know what to do about it. His father's position as principal only made the situation more complicated. He didn't want to seem like he was complaining or playing the race card. The real turning point came during a history presentation. Each student was required to present about their family heritage, and Michael was eager to share stories about his grandmother's civil rights activism and the role his family had played in the community. This was an important part of his identity, and he spoke with pride. But before he could finish his presentation, Mrs. Hall interrupted him. "That's enough," she cut in, even though the timer still had 2 minutes left. Michael looked at the clock in disbelief. He had worked hard on this project, and now she was rushing him through it, as if his heritage was something to be dismissed. When the next student, a boy named Nathan, started his presentation about a summer trip to a baseball game, Mrs. Hall let him speak for an extra 3 minutes. She didn't stop him, despite the fact that it was completely off topic. Instead, she praised him for his wonderfully detailed presentation, offering him a smile that was full of warmth. By now, other students were beginning to notice the pattern. A few whispered to each other, sharing their discomfort with what they had seen. Michael's friends, especially David, were starting to voice their concerns as well. David was vocal, often standing up for Michael, pointing out his correct answers or asking him for help with their homework right in front of Mrs. Hall. But it didn't seem to make a difference. The other students were also starting to change their behavior, supporting Michael in subtle ways. Some even began to wear their hair in different styles, as a silent gesture of solidarity with Michael's own distinctive curly hair. It wasn't much, but it felt like a shift was happening, at least among the students who were willing to speak up. Despite all this, Michael's academic performance in other classes was still strong. He thrived in Mr. Chen's science class, where his experiments were always detailed and his creativity stood out. In art class, his projects were often displayed in the hallway for others to admire. Even in PE, he was picked first for teams. But in Mrs. Hall's class, it was a different story. His grades continued to drop inexplicably. At home, his mother began to notice that Michael wasn't his usual self. He had trouble sleeping, and when he did sleep, he was often restless. At dinner, he had become quieter, not sharing stories about his day like he used to. His parents noticed how he would push his food around his plate without much interest. It worried them. But Michael couldn't bring himself to talk about what was going on at school. How could he tell them? His father, as the principal of the school, was in a delicate position. Michael didn't want to be seen as the child of the principal who couldn't handle his first year at a new school. One day, during a parent-teacher conference, things came to a head. Several parents reported to Mrs. Hall that she seemed to treat certain students with more praise and others with disdain. But it wasn't until David mentioned it that Michael's parents began to take notice of the full extent of the problem. David's mom had called to complain about the way her son's grades had been unfairly marked down when other students had received higher grades for less effort. Meanwhile, the school had started to pick up on the tension. Teachers exchanged concerned glances, and students whispered in the hallways. Some had even noticed the small incidents that had been happening in room 203 for weeks. How Mrs. Hall would wrinkled her nose when walking past Michael's desk. How she would ignore his raised hand. How he would be blamed for the smallest disruptions when other students were left off the hook. Michael began to wonder if he was the only one who saw this. It seemed like the other teachers were aware of the issue, but weren't sure what to do about it. They weren't blind to the way Mrs. Hall treated him, but there seemed to be a fear of stepping in. Days passed, and Michael's internal struggle grew. He knew something had to change, but he didn't know what to do or who to talk to. He knew that the situation had escalated, and sooner or later, something would need to be done. Whether he spoke up or not, the atmosphere in room 203 was becoming unbearable, and Michael knew that his experience was far from isolated. He wasn't the only student facing this kind of treatment. The moment of reckoning finally came on a Tuesday afternoon when the tension in room 203 reached a breaking point. The usual hum of the classroom had been replaced by an uncomfortable silence as Mrs. Hall moved about the room, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. Students were focused on their projects, but there was an underlying unease in the air. No one could ignore the unfair treatment that had been happening in that room for weeks. It started innocently enough, with Mrs. Hall walking past Michael's desk as he worked diligently on his history assignment. She paused, as she often did, to examine his paper with a furrowed brow. Michael tried to focus on the task at hand, his fingers gripping the pen tightly as he wrote about his family's roots and their involvement in social justice movements. But he could feel her eyes on him. Colder than usual, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. "Michael," she called sharply, her voice slicing through the stillness of the room. "This is unreadable." Her tone was dripping with contempt. "You need to do better than this. Your handwriting is a disaster." His heart dropped, but he didn't respond. He had spent hours making sure his paper was neat, legible, and thoughtful. He could feel his face flush as the weight of her words pressed on him. He looked down at his paper, but the mark she had scribbled across it seemed to mock him. The D she gave him felt like a slap in the face. David, who had been working at his own desk, looked over at him with wide eyes. He could tell that something was wrong, but he didn't know how to intervene. As Mrs. Hall walked away, he shot Michael a sympathetic glance, but Michael only gave him a small, tired smile in return. For the rest of the class, Michael was on edge, his thoughts racing. Was this really happening? Was he the only one who saw it? The disparity in treatment was becoming too obvious to ignore. How long would he stay silent? Would things ever change? The final straw came during the art class later that day. Mrs. Hall had been moving from desk to desk, offering praise to some students while ignoring others. When she reached Michael's desk, she didn't even look at his work. Instead, she leaned in close, her breath too sharp for comfort. "Are you sure this is the best you can do?" she asked in a tone that left no room for encouragement. Michael could feel the pressure building inside him, a quiet storm that threatened to explode. His classmates had noticed too. Some whispered, some fidgeted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one dared to speak up. The more time passed, the more it felt like everyone in the room was complicit, either silently tolerating it or too afraid to act. As Mrs. Hall moved on to the next student, Michael's hands clenched into fists on the desk. It wasn't just about the grades or the constant remarks. It was the way she made him feel. Small, insignificant, like he didn't belong. For the first time in weeks, Michael felt a surge of anger, not just at Mrs. Hall, but at the system that allowed this to happen without consequence. That evening, after school, Michael finally decided to tell his parents. His father, Mr. Richardson, was the principal of the school, but Michael had kept quiet for so long, not wanting to draw attention to the situation. But now it had reached a point where he couldn't stay silent any longer. At the dinner table, after the first few minutes of small talk, Michael took a deep breath and finally spoke. "Dad, there's something I need to tell you about school," he began, his voice quiet but firm. His father looked up from his plate, sensing the gravity in Michael's tone. "What's wrong, son?" Mr. Richardson asked, his brow furrowed in concern. Michael hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to frame his words. "It's Mrs. Hall. She's been treating me differently," he said, his voice shaky but determined. "She marks my work down for no reason, ignores me in class, and just makes me feel like I don't belong. It's happening every day." Mrs. Richardson's eyes widened in concern, and she reached out to squeeze Michael's hand. "What do you mean? Why didn't you tell us before?" "I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. I didn't want you to think I was being overly sensitive or that I couldn't handle it. But it's getting worse," Michael said, his voice breaking slightly. "I'm not the only one who's noticed. Even the other students are starting to see it. They don't say anything, but they're starting to get it." Mr. Richardson set down his fork and looked at Michael intently. "You should have come to us sooner, son. But you've done the right thing now. This is serious, and it needs to be dealt with. I'll make sure it's addressed. I promise." The next morning, Michael's father acted swiftly. He called an emergency meeting with the school board, bringing in teachers and staff from all areas of Springfield Middle School. The meeting was tense, but the truth had to be heard. Michael's story was shared, and it resonated with many of the teachers who had witnessed Mrs. Hall's behavior but hadn't known how to intervene. The weight of the evidence was clear, and the support for Michael was overwhelming. As the meeting progressed, it became clear that Mrs. Hall's actions were not isolated. Michael wasn't the only student she had treated unfairly. Other incidents came to light. Students of color were often singled out, ignored, or harshly criticized for small mistakes, while their white peers were given more patience and encouragement. The school had failed to act earlier, but now the problem was front and center, and it could not be ignored. By the end of the day, the decision had been made. Mrs. Hall was placed on immediate leave, pending an investigation, and the school board announced that they would be implementing new training for all teachers on cultural sensitivity and bias. It was a hard pill to swallow, but for Michael and his family, it was a step toward change.